These eyes have been staring at the woman at the next table for over a minute. Will she sense it? Will she turn around to find out where it's coming from? This dog is always in the doorway when his owner gets home. How does it know when to go there? These pigeons, out for a meal, will soon try to get back to the loft. Will they be able to find it, even though it was moved just after they flew the coop? These common everyday experiences raise profound questions about the ties that bind all living creatures, and about why science has been unable to explain these age-old mysteries. 7 experiments that could change the world. A do-it-yourself guide to revolutionary science. The quest and work of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Science now gets blamed for many of the problems of the modern world, whereas 20 or 30 years ago, scientists were heroes who everyone admired. They were the pioneers of the future. But now, science is seen not as the solution, but as part of the problem. And I think this has led to a decline in faith in mechanistic science and a search for other ways of looking at the world. The official doctrine of life and nature, the mechanistic theory, says that we're machines, that animals and plants are machines too, and that we can't do anything a machine can't do. Of course, we can do lots of things machines can't do. So then they say, well, that's because we haven't yet made machines that are smart enough to do all these things, but we're working on artificial intelligence and computers. But the doctrine that everything we do or that happens in nature should fit in with the known laws of physics and chemistry is nothing but a dogma. If something doesn't fit in with those laws, then the response is to ignore it or to deny it.
Dr. Rupert Sheldrake is a double first scholar at Clare College in Cambridge, England. He was also a Frank Knox Fellow at Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Back in Cambridge, England, he became a director of studies in biochemistry and cell biology. At an unusually early age, he was named a Research Fellow of Great Britain's Royal Society and has always been known as an advocate of unconventional thinking. Dr. Sheldrake has spent his life articulating his complex ideas in the familiar terms of every man's experience. He believes that a curiosity about nature starts early and remembers how one particular experience shaped his future ideas.
When I was a child, I suppose about 5, I saw a fence made out of willow stakes. They were just dead pieces of wood. But the amazing thing is that some of them had come to life. These dead bits of matter had sprouted. This made a deep impression on me. It gave me a sense of the regenerative power of life. And then I saw it underlay a lot of my interest in the powers of nature, the spontaneous organizing abilities of the natural world. And this really has dominated my thinking for as long as I can remember.
Convinced that too many phenomena defy the explanations of conventional biology, in 1981, Dr. Sheldrake speculated the existence of a force he called morphic resonance. He suggested that the past forms and behaviors of organisms influence organisms in the present through direct connections across time and space. The old guard scientific community greeted this with outrage, the new scientists with hearty cheers. Undaunted, in 1988, Sheldrake raised the stakes by proposing that all natural systems, from crystals to human society, inherit a collective memory that influences their form and behavior. In 1991, Dr. Sheldrake made yet one more attempt to convince the scientific establishment with a treatise, showing how the machine theory of the universe just didn't work. He reminded modern scientists of ancient wisdom, which treated the earth and its creatures as a living, feeling, thinking whole, not just as a soulless machine. Could it be, Sheldrake asked, that we really are connected across time and space in ways that modern science can't explain? Sir John Maddox, editor of the highly respected journal Nature, denounced Sheldrake in a dramatic editorial entitled A Book for Burning.
It's unnecessary to introduce magic into the explanation of physical and biological phenomena, when in fact there's every likelihood that the continuation of research as it's now practiced will indeed fill all the gaps that Sheldrake draws attention to. You see, Sheldrake's is not a scientific theory. Sheldrake is putting forward magic instead of science. And that can be condemned, but in exactly the language that the popes used to condemn Galileo. And for the same reasons, it is heresy.
Not all the scientific establishment, however, has been opposed to Dr. Sheldrake's ideas. Michael Kenward of the New Scientist magazine questions Nature's approach by asking,
does this mean that Nature has abandoned the scientific method whereby ideas are launched onto the world to be tested by the scientific community, or are we to have trial by editorial?
Having failed to entirely win over the scientific community, Dr. Sheldrake began making his case directly to the public.
I started on this kind of search because I was convinced that there was more to life than biology seemed to have dreamt of. And it doesn't take much, really, to come to that conclusion. I mean, everyone in this room could probably come to the same conclusion. But for me, the conflict was sharpened by the fact that as a child I was very interested in animals and plants, and I kept a lot of pets and was very keen on plants as well. And it was precisely because I had such a strong connection with animals and plants that I wanted to do biology. But the more biology I did at school and at university, the more I was drawn into this kind of mechanistic way of thinking. The first thing you did to study an animal or plant in the laboratory was to kill it and then cut it up. And later on in the more advanced stages, then you got into vivisection, and you had to develop a way of distancing yourself emotionally from what you were doing. If you thought too hard about what you were doing, you wouldn't do it, you see. But yet you had to do this to be qualified as a biologist. It's an initiation rite that forces this emotional distancing on biology students. So I felt this conflict in a particularly strong way. And it was homing pigeons that was the first thing that got me interested in trying to go beyond existing science, because I thought about this idea of moving the home, and saw that you could actually begin to deal with some of these mysteries by finding simple experiments. It wasn't that everything had been tried and had failed. It was that in most of these areas, no one had even tried to investigate these things. When I realized that, then I saw that around us all, there are mysteries about which we all know, but which science hadn't looked at. And then I, over the years, have been thinking about ways of tackling them experimentally. As a matter of necessity, I tried to think of very cheap ways of doing these experiments where you could avoid the lack of funding problem by not needing it, or needing very little. So really it was that conflict between my own experience and the official doctrines of mechanistic biology that triggered off this quest in me.
Sheldrake's book, 7 Experiments That Can Change the World, is a direct challenge to the scientific establishment. Its subtitle, A Do-It-Yourself Guide to Revolutionary Science, makes it clear that Sheldrake wants to be sure that everyone, especially non-scientists, join in the debate. He likes to say that you can do most of the experiments in the book for less than $20. Most of the experiments focus on familiar, real-life events. Pets and their masters. The sense of being stared at. How pigeons home. The variability of fundamental constants. How termites organize. The reality of phantom limbs. The effect of experimenters' expectations. We'll focus here on the first 3, which have generated the most excitement.
Well, many people have dogs or cats that seem to know when they're coming home. And the question I'm asking is this a paranormal phenomenon or not? Nobody knows, because nobody has investigated. It's been totally ignored by scientists, even though thousands of scientists must have dogs or cats that know when they're coming home from the laboratory. I mean, this is a common phenomenon, apparently. So I'm really asking the question, is it a paranormal phenomenon or not? Now, if it's not a paranormal phenomenon, then you should be able to explain it in terms of familiar sounds or smells, or the dog responding to a person at home knowing when the person's coming. So the test, the real experiment here, is to come home at an unexpected time and to come home in an unusual way, so that the dog or cat can't learn anything from the people at home, it can't learn anything from routine expectation, and it can't smell or hear a familiar car because the person's not coming in a familiar car or by any familiar means. If under those conditions the dog or cat still responds, this would suggest to me a paranormal influence, something rather like telepathy. Most households in North America and in Western Europe have pets in them. Most people have a lot of experience of animals through their pets. There's an incredible body of knowledge and information about pets, because after all, people are watching their pets 7 days a week, 365 days a year usually, and they know them pretty well. Yet, oddly enough, this incredible amount of information about pet animals has been totally disregarded by established science. And the studies we have of animal behavior in science are either based on things like rats kept in uniform laboratory cages, or animals in the wild like chimpanzees in Burundi, or gorillas in the Congo. But there's something much closer to home, namely our pets, which tells us a great deal about animal behavior. As soon as I started talking to pet owners about their pet stories, I found there was an incredible wealth of information. Most pet owners have got really interesting stories to tell about their animals, and they're usually only too willing to tell them if anyone's prepared to listen.
I have a dog for 8 years, and every morning I take that dog for a walk. The dog gets excited, can't wait, except for those mornings where I'm going to take the dog to a vet. The dog senses, the dog knows this is not going to be a walk. And the dog hides, the dog is not excited, and the dog knows that he is going to the vet and not for a walk.
When I found out that my grandfather had died, this was unexpected. I was in the middle of making a trip to go and see him. I knew he was sick, but he was supposed to have much more time. And from out of nowhere, he's at my feet, and he's clawing his way up me. And it's actually when he got to me and was clawing his way up me, that's when I started to cry. I didn't call for him, I didn't scream, he just knew. I just knew he knew there was something really wrong.
I have a special connection with my fox terrier, Toby, who's 8 years old. 6 years ago, my sister had a very large home when I was with a group of people at a cocktail party. My dog loves water. She loves to swim. I was in a group of people, and I suddenly was swept with a sense of dread and terror. And I shouted out her name. It wasn't even none of this was conscious. I shouted out her name. I ran from the downstairs of this house, through the backyard to the pool, and Toby was in the middle of the pool, surrounded, wrapped up in the pool hose, and couldn't get out. And I jumped in, fished her out, she was fine. And then a year later, the same thing happened. I got to the edge of the pool, and where Toby would normally get out, the 2 exit areas had been filled with pool floats, and she was floundering at the edge and really going down for the last time. This is a connection of not just me to my dog, but the dog
Such a nut.
speaking to me.
Okay, I'll see you later. I'll be back after lunch. Bye.
The only other person I've ever met who's been interested in this phenomenon, who's been researching it, namely Miriam Rothschild, who's one of Britain's leading naturalists, has been investigating the behaviour of the dog of a friend of hers, the Marchioness of Salisbury, Lady Salisbury, who lives in one of Britain's grandest houses, Hatfield House, a huge Elizabethan mansion in Hertfordshire. She'd been investigating this and has been keeping a log of the behaviour of Lady Salisbury's dog, Jessie.
Servants that work for Lady Salisbury love the little dog because they get fair warning of her ladyship's return, hours before it happens, giving them ample time to clean and prepare the house, to her satisfaction.
She gets restless. She does get restless. Even if I go for a weekend, you know, she gets restless by the time I'm coming back. And she's left with you met our head gardener. He stays with him. And she jumps down wherever she's sitting, you know, and goes to his front door. And then it's very difficult to move away from the door.
We never know exactly when her ladyship's coming home, but we normally notice that she starts getting restless. Sometimes she'll make a small barking noise, but she constantly goes to the front door and then sits there. And if you open the front door, she then runs to the gate. And if the gate happens to be open, she'll actually go straight down to the house and then stay at the house.
And of course we've done all the thing that Dr. Sheldrake advised, which is to go in a different car, for instance, to the airport, because he says that she can recognise the sound of the wheels of our own car, and although it's somewhere away from the gardener's house where she is, that she would note this. I've gone in a stranger's car, as it were, to the airport, and we've really eliminated the possibility that she should hear. She hears the sound of the wheels. There must be something, and there must be some kind of communication, or I don't know what you call it, telepathy, or how she senses. It's not that I'm thinking of her, or one wonders whether it isn't something like I don't know. It must be some extra sense that we don't understand about, or we don't know much about.
In other cases, it was possible to do even more detailed observations. And the person who was most helpful was an unemployed secretary called Pam Smart, who lives near Manchester in the north of England. And her dog, her parents had noticed, always seemed to know when she was on the way home. And she kept a very careful log, and over 35 occasions that she studied, the dog always responded when she was coming home, except for 3. On these 3 occasions, there was no response. I asked her if there was anything special about those occasions. She said on 2 of them, the dog was very preoccupied with a bitch on heat in the adjacent apartment. And on 1 of them, there was a dog visiting the flat, and so she thought that perhaps these might have distracted it. I think a reasonable hypothesis. On the other occasions, the dog went to the door at the time she was leaving to come home.
Dr. Sheldrake asked Pam to participate in his project, and she agreed. For the experiment, a camera crew arrived with 2 cameras. One would stay with JT, and the other would travel miles away with Pam. The time codes on both cameras were coordinated so that both were in sync. Accompanied by a researcher, Pam left JT at home with her parents. JT stayed in his favorite spot for hours. Pam spent the day walking through the streets, window shopping, a cup of tea and a scone at Bailey's tea shop. JT just stayed by her mother's feet. After she had been out for over 3 hours, Pam was told it's time to go home.
Sorry for interrupting you, Pam, but now it's time. It's what we choose.
Right.
It's now nearly 10 minutes before 3.
Yeah?
10 minutes to 3 and we leave now.
Right, oh, we've got to go back now. Right, so
Okay,
I've got to...
You have to get a taxi.
Right.
Okay. Where can we get a taxi?
You know where we were filming before?
Yeah.
Watch the time code figures at the bottom of the screen and see what happens.
Knock on the door there. Yeah?
Okay, let's go.
So, right, go and get a taxi.
Yeah.
Almost exactly. How could the moment that Pam got up to go home send JT to the window?
We're going home now, Pam. Do you think of JT now at the moment?
Now you said that, yes, I'm thinking about him. I wasn't really thinking too much about him before, but it doesn't seem to matter whether I'm thinking about him or not.
Remember, she's still 10 minutes away, and the van she is riding in is strange to both Pam and JT.
He's not a remarkable dog.
Once again, as it happens hundreds of times a day all over the world, pet and owner are reunited at the front door.
Good boy. Good boy. Good boy. Oh,
Stay there, stay.
Yes, he's a good boy. Look at that. Right, if the guy wants a good boy. Oh, good boy.
Well, here's another example, completely independent. There's an actual photograph of this one. This person is called David Waite, and his cat's called Godzilla. There's Godzilla. And David Waite is a public relations consultant and works from home. And this is his story. In the halcyon days before the recession, my telephone used to ring many times each day. When I went away several times per year, my parents came to mind the house and the cat and to monitor the phone. It was my practice to call home from North Africa, the Middle East and Europe to check that all was well and to get any messages. It seems that whenever I called, my cat would run and sit beside the telephone as it was ringing and before it was picked up, whereas she ignored the other calls which my parents took on my behalf. And the calls were made at random times. Well, you see, this is a very, very fascinating phenomenon. It would be very easy to have video cameras that switched on automatically every time the telephone began ringing, again a clock beside the telephone, and monitor this phenomenon. You could do statistical tests, ask people to ring home at randomized times, and so forth. So I'm keenly pursuing cats that can do this. And unfortunately, Godzilla's a little bit senile and doesn't seem up to it anymore. The only one I've been able to find that's still alive and compos mentis is one that unfortunately lives in the country and roams far and wide during the summer, and so is unable to come to the telephone. This is one active field of research, and as you can see, the prospects for really interesting results with pets are very bright. I mean, already the results are absolutely fascinating. Skeptics won't like this, of course, and will try to think of arguments why it may not be a real phenomenon. But the thing to do is to listen to their arguments, and if they can think of good objections, to tighten up the conditions of the experiments. Now, this research, plus many more cases, has made me pretty sure that we're dealing here with a real phenomenon, that a great deal of this behavior of dogs and cats does seem to depend on something more akin to telepathy than to anything within the inventory of scientific explanation within orthodox science. The conventional view in the West now is that the mind is inside the head. This is a very peculiar theory in historical terms. It's only existed in Europe for about 300 years. I think that when we see things outside ourselves, as for example when people see me, that in some sense their mind is reaching out to touch what they're looking at. We don't experience what we're seeing as being inside our head. I'm simply entertaining the very simple possibility that our experience is telling us something true. Is it possible that something really does go out of the eyes? Is it possible that there really is something coming out of your eyes to where I am, as you see me now, and coming out of my eyes to where you are, as I see you. Would it be possible, for example, for somebody to tell when they were being looked at from behind, even though they didn't know when they were being looked at?
So he asked a young friend to participate. He picked out a subject. Unaware that he had stopped to stare, she continued reading. A minute later, sensing something, she turned and looked directly into his eyes.
I think that amateurs and students can be more innovative than professionals because they've got nothing to lose. They can do things without fear. Professionals are better at sustained work over long periods, and I see a complementary relationship, such as existed in the past, between amateurs and professionals.
In search of recruits, Sheldrake found some of the students involved in staring experiments of their own, for different reasons. Several members of the senior class were interested in what Dr. Sheldrake had to say and volunteered their services. Just after 9 a.m. on a gray English morning, they crossed a courtyard, headed for the headmaster's chambers.
Consider what happens when you see me sitting here. The official theory is that light goes from me through the electromagnetic field, through your lens, inverted image on the retina, electrical and chemical changes in retinal cells, impulses up the optic nerve, and a complex electrochemical pattern of activity in the brain, particularly the optical cortex. So far, so good. And that can be studied and has been studied by neurophysiologists. The next bit's much more mysterious. You form a subjective image of me as a result of these changes in your brain. That's totally unexplained by anybody. And then, more mysterious still, although never considered or discussed, is the fact that your experience of me, which is supposed to be inside your head, is probably experienced by you not as inside your head, but as being where I'm actually sitting. In other words, your image of me is a mental image. It's produced by your mind. It's in your mind. But I imagine that you experience that image of me as being located right here, not inside your head. Now, if it's located right here, it means that your mind is reaching out beyond your brain, through your eyes, filling the perceptual environment in which you are, so that even if you're outside looking at a distant place, your mind is reaching out that far. If you're looking at a star at night, your mind is reaching out over literally astronomical distances to touch that star. Now, if I'm not just playing with words, it should be possible to detect the influence of the eyes upon something. If we touch things with our mind when we look at them, if our minds reach out in some sense to touch them, then we might affect what we're looking at just by looking at it. So, then we think, well, how could you actually examine this experimentally? Well, think of another person. Could another person tell if you're looking at them just because you're looking at them? It's a common everyday experience. Many people have actually experienced this feeling of being looked at from behind. In surveys that have been done to find out how many people have experienced this, it's about 80 to 90% of a normal population. So I imagine most of you have had this experience. And surveys have also been done to look at it from both points of view. More women than men have had the experience of being looked at, and more men than women have had the experience of doing the looking and finding people turn around. But, so has everyone here had that feeling at one stage or another? Yeah. You know what it is. Basically what happens in this experiment is that one person looks at the back of the other person. They flip the coin to decide whether to look or not to look. If it's heads, you look at the other person. If it's tails, you look away and think of something else. And to indicate to the other person when the trial begins, you make a sound. This mechanical device gives a standard click. This comes from a coat hanger in one of the department stores. And it's effectively free if you buy enough coats. So now I'm going to do the click, and now I'm gazing at the back of your neck. Yes, so that's right. And I then say, right, and I score it. Well, I'll get out of the way now, and I won't be watching.
Look.
Not looking.
Well, you're looking.
Yes.
Not looking.
Not looking.
No, it's not looking.
Not looking.
Not looking.
So now what we want to do is change over so the person who's doing the looking is now looked at. So we're staying with the same partners, just switching over.
Looking. Not looking. You're looking. Not looking. You're not looking.
I was looking.
Looking. Not looking.
No,
I'm looking.
I wasn't.
Okay?
Not looking.
That's right.
Well, this looks interesting. May we take part?
Yes.
The philosophy class next door wondered what the commotion was and was invited in to participate in a group stare.
Looking.
Correct.
Not looking.
Correct.
Dr. Sheldrake tallied the results of this day's experimentation, and when added to previous statistics, the odds against it occurring by chance in thousands of trials are over 10 billion to 1.
Now, most people aren't terribly good at this under the artificial conditions of experiments, but some people are, and these experiments help to find out people who are unusually sensitive. I'm told even in standard British commando training, they tell people if they're going to attack somebody from behind and they're creeping up not to look at them, because they're more likely to pick up that they're being approached if they do. So that's one category of people who probably be very good subjects for this. The other category would, of course, be paranoids. But, of course, they'd be very hard to work with. Firstly, all the known theories, smell, magnetism, sound, sun, landmarks, and so on, all these theories have been ruled out. So the conventional senses are not the explanation. I mean, of course, pigeons use conventional senses, but these alone can't explain their homing ability. So I think the only conclusion left is that the pigeons have a direct connection with their home of a kind unknown to science, a sixth sense, if you like, of where their home is, or a directional sense. And I think this may depend on a field, because fields are what connect things together at a distance. I think of it as like an invisible elastic band connecting the pigeon to its home. Every conceivable theory has been tested to destruction. The first theory suggested by Charles Darwin was that they remember their way home by remembering the twists and turns of the outward journey. Well, that theory has been refuted by anaesthetising pigeons, putting them in rotating drums in the back of sealed vans in the darkness, and driving them by devious routes to the point of release. When these poor birds come round and are released, they fly straight home. The second theory is the smell theory. They sniff the loft from hundreds of miles away, even if the wind's blowing the wrong way. Well, that's been tested by sealing up their nostrils with sealing wax and other methods of preventing any information from the nose, from the olfactory sense, and they still get home. Pigeon homing has been investigated quite intensively for 100 years, and all this research has so far drawn a blank. No one knows how they do it. And this is the tip of the iceberg of the vastly larger phenomenon of homing behavior in many other kinds of animals. There are many stories about dogs and cats that can home when they're left somewhere away from home. And many other animals and birds can home. And this, in turn, is part of the larger problem of understanding migration of animals. How do monarch butterflies fly up from Mexico, for example, to the Great Lakes region, breed, and after a couple of generations in the summer, their grandchildren, the ones that have flown up, fly back to Mexico and overwinter in exactly the same areas, sometimes the very same trees that their grandparents had come from a year before. And in the case of pigeons, you'll often hear from people, well, I'm sure it's all been explained in terms of magnetism, but I can't remember the details. That's the usual response you get if you talk to scientists about it.
A magnetic coil is placed on the pigeon's head, but the results are the same.
Well, the evidence for magnetism is very weak. The evidence that they respond to the magnetic field is ambiguous, highly disputed, and the experiments that seem to show it have proved to be unrepeatable. I'm simply putting forward the hypothesis that pigeons are connected to their home by something we could compare, I'd think of it as a field that links them to their home. What I'm concerned with at the moment is to find out whether there is an unknown field. So the way to test this theory is to do the opposite of all the experiments done so far. All these experiments have involved taking the pigeon from the home and seeing if it can find the home. This experiment is the opposite. It involves taking the home from the pigeons and seeing if they can find the home when it's been taken away. And for this purpose, one needs a mobile pigeon loft. I bought one of the upmarket ones from an advertisement in Racing Pigeon Weekly. And there's a whole range of products advertised in that magazine. And this is then mounted on the back of an old farm trailer so that it's mobile. You can just tow it around with a Land Rover or a tractor or something. I was fairly confident we'd be able to work with mobile lofts because I started reading up the history of the subject and soon found that a considerable amount of work had been done with mobile lofts during the First World War. The British Pigeon Corps had 150 mobile lofts during the First World War, which were converted London buses and were used to move the communications headquarters based on pigeons around as the front line moved during the war. And this information I've got from a little-known but fascinating volume called Pigeons in the Great War by Colonel Osman, who was officer commanding pigeons. And so they were used in the Second World War as well. The British used them in Burma and India. There was a special Indian pigeon corps, and I've been in correspondence with the commanding officer of it, who's still alive in retirement in Britain. So far, what I've shown with this research is that you can train pigeons to home to mobile lofts.
Dr. Sheldrake traveled to Holland for the experiment on pigeon homing. Dr. Wim Nieboer from the University of Utrecht and Dutch filmmaker Louis van Gasteren initiated their project based on Sheldrake's hypothesis that pigeons could find their loft even if it was moved and partially hidden. At 9:25 on a gray and slightly cloudy Dutch morning, the team was assembled and the experiment was launched. That way, the team could monitor the paths of the pigeons and would know how many of them had made their way back to the loft successfully. The pigeons were boxed and placed at point A. The researchers started the mobile loft on its journey from point A, charting a course with some impediments so that the loft would be removed from the line of sight, leads the team in the loft to point B. The campus of the university has natural impediments: trees, roads, buildings. Observers marked the loft and speculated to themselves on their chance of success. Dr. Niebuhr will show the research team the spot which has been chosen, and then he waits patiently for the loft to arrive. Dr. Niebuhr notes the exact location of the loft on a GPS. The pigeon's home is prepared, its opening placed in a southward direction. Finally, 15 pigeons are released at point A, and they begin their flight in search of the warmth and the comfort of their loft. The flight is magnificent. As they circle point A, they realize that something is wrong. Their loft has been moved. The team watches intently as the pigeons check things out. Sometime later, all 15 pigeons land on the exact spot where they had been released from the loft. Their loft, 900 meters away, just sits there and waits. The pigeons take off and begin their search in earnest.
The earliest mobile loft experiment we know about is described in the book of Genesis. Noah's Ark was, among other things, a mobile pigeon loft. When Noah released the pigeon or dove to see if there was dry land, on one occasion it came back with an olive twig in its beak, showing that there was dry land. In order to come back to the ark, it must have been able to find a mobile loft at sea.
They settle down for a brief rest and use the time to talk things over. Food and companionship in the loft is there for them. All they have to do is find it. Finally, the pigeons zero in on the location. But during their flyover, they realize that 3 of the original 15 are missing. And they set off in search of them. And then 2 of the 3 catch up, and now only 1 is still missing. Dr. Niebuhr is concerned as he searches for the missing pigeon. There it is, the last of the missing pigeons, and once more the full group of gypsies is reunited.
Pigeons are doing it by an unknown force, sense, ability, power, faculty, sixth sense, call it what you will. There's something unknown at work here that's not on the current scientific map of reality. Again, I think it could be due to a morphic field that links them to their home, connecting the pigeons to their home, and the morphic field acting like a, if you like, a kind of invisible elastic band connecting them to their home position.
The pigeons glide down through the airwaves and land on their loft. Happy to be home again.
After it's happened 4 or 5 times, they get used to it, and they realise they're now gypsy pigeons. And they don't seem to mind. And so far, we've moved the loft out to 5 miles, taken some of them out, moved the loft, released them at the place where the loft used to be, then driven back to the place where the loft now is, and found them all waiting on the roof. They've flown straight there. It takes them hours before they'll go in. And I think you can easily see that that's fairly easy to understand if you think of what would happen when you went home from here. If your home had moved about 100 yards, you wouldn't just go straight in the door as if nothing had happened. You'd probably behave just like these pigeons did. The big experiment is to move the loft 50 miles, 100 miles or more. I'm happy to say this experiment's now been taken up in Holland at the University of Utrecht, and at this very moment the loft is being moved around Holland and the pigeons are trying to find it. I think there's a reasonable chance that this could work because there are many stories of dogs and cats that have been able to find owners who've moved away from home. This is not homing dogs and cats that come back home, but this is dogs and cats that have been left at home. Their owner goes away and then they find him or her even though they've never been to that place before.
The other 4 experiments, which we'll only summarize here, raise significant and unanswered questions about how much we really know, and even about the vaunted scientific method itself.
How constant are the so-called fundamental constants of nature? The speed of light, for example, is assumed to be completely constant in science. Yet, if you look at the actual measurements over the years, it varies. Oddly enough, between 1928 and 1945, the speed of light dropped by 20 kilometers per second all over the world. Then it went up again. In 1972, the speed of light was fixed by definition by an international panel of experts, but the other constants, like the so-called universal gravitational constant, have continued to vary. Termites present a dramatic example of the problem posed by animal societies. How are the activities of the different individuals coordinated so they all work together for the good of the whole? If you drive a steel sheet vertically into a termite mound, the termites on both sides of the sheet repair the damage, building arches, and when you take the sheet out, you find the arches match up perfectly on both sides. There seems to be an invisible plan or blueprint. I think that's due to the morphic field of the whole termite colony. When people have had a limb amputated, they usually feel as if it's still there. They can move it around and sometimes they feel pain in it. What kind of reality do these phantom limbs have? Everyone's heard of wishful thinking and self-fulfilling prophecy. In medical research, blank pills that doctors and patients think are wonder drugs can have dramatic effects. I think much mainstream science may be less objective than we usually suppose, and experiments may turn out to be influenced by what researchers believe ought to be happening.
Dr. Sheldrake lives and writes at home near London's Hampstead Heath.
How I got interested in things, I suddenly remembered.
On a windy afternoon, Dr. Sheldrake met with John Roach, chairman of Wellspring Media, to discuss his concepts.
Plants, particularly the way that cuttings take root.
Are you suggesting that modern science is on the wrong track?
Well, modern science since 1620 or thereabouts has been based on the idea that nature's just a machine, the cosmos is a machine, animals and plants are machines, and that we're machines. And I don't think it's exactly wrong, it's just a very limited way of looking at things. It's particularly good for making machines. We've got technology, the Industrial Revolution. I don't think it applies very well to plants and animals, to Gaia, the planet Earth, or indeed to the cosmos. Before the 17th century, everyone agreed that we were living organisms, even that the Earth was a living organism, the universe a living organism. We've had this machine theory of nature right up until now, and I think we're finally outgrowing it.
Are all of the advances that were made in the machine theory era to be lost, or are these two things in any way compatible?
I see what's happening now as a broadening of science. It doesn't mean the machine theory was totally wrong. It means it was a limited metaphor, just a way of looking at nature, a model of the world, what people often call a paradigm. And we're shifting into a new paradigm, a new model of the world, where we see the world as alive again. So it's not that the machine theory is wrong, it's too narrow. It gave a kind of tunnel vision, looking at one aspect of things. I think what's happening now is we're getting a broader picture. What was right about the machine theory stays right. It's just that we look at things that we ignored.
Would you talk a little bit about morphic resonance and what the concept means in layman's terms?
Morphic resonance is the idea that similar things influence subsequent similar things. It's the basis of the memory in nature, the habits of nature. So as a plant grows, as one of these trees grows, it's tuning in to the form of previous trees of the same species. And this memory transfer across space and time is what takes place by morphic resonance. Each species has a kind of collective memory. Each individual draws on the collective memory and contributes to it.
I'm told Sir John Maddox has suggested that maybe your books might be burned.
Sir John Maddox, the editor of Nature, sees himself as a kind of pope of the scientific establishment. And in many ways, scientists like him behave as if science is the church of the modern world. It's like the Catholic Church before the Reformation.
But aren't the heretics always the ones who take us the next step? I mean, Galileo, in the long term, was right.
Galileo was right in the long term. Not all heretics are right, though. I mean, a lot of heretics are wrong and fizzle out. But the fact is, it's the heresy of today, maybe the orthodoxy of tomorrow. It's the way that science progresses.
I must say, that's one of the things that I read in your book that I found terribly exciting, which is that you feel that science, in the establishment sense, tends to sweep under the rug anything that it cannot explain. Is that a fair characterization of your view?
Yes, I mean, it happens all the way through the history of science. If something doesn't fit in, then it tends to get ignored. And there's a lot that doesn't fit into the present official scientific worldview, and it's been ignored. And it's precisely through paying attention to what's been neglected or ignored that we can open our view of things. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
So every member of a Rupert Sheldrake lecture audience has a potential role as a member of the field research team.
Yes, I mean, some of these experiments are things that literally anybody can do. And I think that's a very empowering thought for people. I find it empowering that science doesn't have to be confined to a tiny coterie of professionals who get grants and are approved by committees, that it's something anyone can participate in. I think by paying attention to experience, by building on what are the problems and the curiosities of everyday life, that a bridge can be built between our experience, curiosity, and the world of professional science.
Wellspring Media hopes every one of you will now go into the world with a new sense of curiosity and a new spirit of scientific inquiry. Send Wellspring the results of any experiment Dr. Sheldrake's work has suggested, and we'll send you a certificate of participation welcoming you to his cause. Science is an adventure anyone can undertake, and should your experiment capture his interest, you may even get a call from Dr. Sheldrake himself. Thank you very much.